Okay, so I'd like to get started first by just asking on a show of hands, if we were to just cancel this and take a hour and 15-minute nap, how many people would be in favor of that? Yeah. It's a minority, but it's a close one. Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna get started more or less. Anybody here from out of town? Yeah. Thank you. Couple of things to know. The first of which is that there will be a Q. This will end with a Q&A session, so all questions can be asked, but feel free to interrupt at any time. Secondly, I am losing my voice, so patience, please. I'm desperately hoping this isn't some kind of ironic poetic justice thing where I finish this and then I'm never able to speak again. I'm really nervous about that, actually. The next is that, just so you're forewarned, I have invited Danger Ranger and Dusty and some other people to get beer, come hang out in the back and heckle me. I don't know if they're actually going to do it, but just be prepared. And finally, I'm Caveat, and this is Misha, or Body Check. Everybody needs to call her Body Check. With check, so you know, being C-Z-E-C-H. Right? Yeah.
That is body, B-A-W-D-Y.
And Ian, who does not have a cool name, so far as I know. If anyone wants to come up with one, the floor is open.
How about we call him Cool Name?
Cool name. I don't know, that might stick. And they're both meta-regionals, and we'll be talking a bit with you as well. So, with that said, I'm going to get going. I'm going to read from some prepared stuff and also just sort of ad-lib a bit, so it's going to be a mixed bag. Hopefully it'll work out. I originally wanted to call this presentation Why the 10 Principles Will Never Help You Win Your Argument About Burning Man with That Shirt-Cocking DJ You Hate So Much. Apparently that was too long or something, and it didn't turn out that way. But I know. But I hope that's how you'll think of this. Because that's actually sort of capturing the spirit of what I wanted to get at. And they say that the 10 principles are the thing that unifies us. And to some extent that's true, but I think in a lot of ways that's not true. Only one example of that being that most burners cannot name all 10 principles when put on the spot. And I have in fact promised my panelists that I will not put them on the spot that way. But it's quite true. It doesn't really do that. We try to live by the 10 principles, and there's a remarkable agreement in an otherwise very fractious community that these things are okay. That, yeah, they're pretty much what we're talking about. But in a lot of ways, we do not interpret them similarly, and there's no body of doctrine or definitive answers we can go to. And the nature of Burning Man as a duocracy and an event predicated on people following their passions means that there's a certain level of not just unanimity, but uniformity that you're never going to get, and that's okay. I laughed my ass off once when a friend of mine told me, I complimented him on how much I loved his theme camp, and he said, yeah, you know, I really realized that we were finally a part of Burning Man when somebody accused us of ruining it. Right? So when we talk about the 10 principles, I think it's important to go in understanding that we're not going to leave with everybody being on the same page, and that's okay. That's not required, and I'm going to go into that in a lot more depth. But I think it's also important to recognize that that's not necessarily what the 10 principles are supposed to accomplish anyway. I mean, the origin of the 10 principles came out of the regional network, actually, as the regionals were expanding more and more, getting bigger and bigger, and they went back to Burning Man and said, hey, we need a better way of talking about this. We have no good way of describing what we do or who we are to our community, and can you help with that? And Larry wrote the 10 principles in response to that, but I want you to think about this. When people...
Actually, it was 9 principles. He said, go back and get another one.
Danger, Ranger, ladies and gentlemen, yes. Yes, that is true. That is exactly right. But when you think about it, when people came and said, hey, we need a better way to talk about this, the response was 10 principles. And it did not have to be that way. I mean, the natural thing to do for most organizations when someone says, hey, can you describe yourself and tell us what you're about, is to come up with a position paper, a mission statement, a white paper, a press release, anything which would actually be a lot more definitive and give you much clearer answers about what we do and what we are, right? I mean, there are so many other ways when you're asked that question to come up and say, oh no, this is what it is, and virtually all of them are much clearer. They're much less prone to ambiguity. So in many respects, it's important to recognize that when asked, what is Burning Man, what does it do, the answer that was given was the one calculated to provide the most ambiguity possible while still giving a genuine roadmap. That's not an accident. There's not only need for interpretation, but constant reinterpretation. That's baked in. That's with 10 principles instead of a dictionary encyclopedia kind of entry. That's what you're going to get, and that's not an accident. So what that means to me is that when we look at the 10 principles and ask them for specific answers, well, what do the 10 principles say I ought to do? We're not actually using them correctly. That's not what they're good for. Now, it's understandable that we want them to do that. Well, I'm having a volunteer problem. What do I do? Well, consult the 10 principles. I follow step A, B, and C. We want them to do that because that's usually what cultural interdicts do. They tell us who we are and what we do, honor the Sabbath and keep it holy, or at least don't do, thou shalt not kill, or what rights and privileges our membership comes with, free speech. The guidelines of most cultures are designed, at heart, to tell us which side of a line we're on and what we have to do to stay there. There are always loopholes and questions, but the goal of a system of cultural interdiction is to minimize ambiguity, which is where the comparison breaks down for Burning Man, because the 10 principles don't minimize ambiguity, they generate it. That's in part because, with the possible exception of leave no trace, none of the 10 principles are measurable by quantifiable means. There is no scale of self-expression from 1 to 10, such that if you wear fuzzy boots, show cleavage, and spin poi, you are 2 points more personally expressive than someone who dyes his hair and draws graphic sex acts on the back of compostable coffee cups. In fact, I'm going to pull this out. Not only is there no quantifiable measurement to adequately describe whether someone is following the principles, but the very act of attempting to make such a rubric is itself a violation of the principles. To insist that everyone express themselves the same way is to render those who refuse more radically self-expressive. If you try to do that, the people who break your rules are the ones doing it right. Right. To insist that there is only a few correct ways to include people is itself to violate radical inclusion. What about the people who want to include other people other ways? Suddenly you're creating more of a system that is itself the problem. And perhaps most difficult of all, and this is something that is widely commented on and is absolutely right, the principles contradict one another. Self-reliance and communal effort, civic responsibility and radical self-expression. These things make different demands on the same individuals during the same circumstances. And of course, the result is ambiguity, massive ambiguity. If we're upset by this, and people have been, if we're upset by this, it's because we want our lives to be made easy. Just tell me the right answer so I can be a good fucking burner and get on with my life. I sympathize. We've all been there. But the things that the 10 principles are calibrated to accomplish, what they're supposed to do, is to help us humanize one another, to form community, to generate new art and expression, to burn. And these are not accomplished when people are just trying to get their work done and go home. There is no shortcut to radical self-expression or to immediacy. These are things that you either throw yourself into or you're not really doing it at all. I suppose in a sense this takes us back to some of Burning Man's earliest predecessors, the Suicide Club, which was literally correct me if I'm wrong, literally a pact you would sign and say, I'm going to live these days like they're potentially my last. You throw yourself into it or you're not really doing it. The 10 principles are designed for that kind of activity, not, I'm going to get my work done and then go home and whatever. So that is to say, the 10 principles aren't calibrated to make our lives easier. They are calibrated to get us off our asses and engage with those elements of the human experience that can't be effectively quantified or commodified. Thank you. Are we doing that or are we not doing that? And there's no universal answer because the unquantifiable aspects of life are situational. While I can offer suggestions on whether I think what someone is doing is in line with best practice, and there is value in that, absolutely. There is value in being able to talk about these things well and communicate with one another and share ideas. I can't possibly judge what enhances self-expression or community or participation in a unique situation with specific people. I can't do that sitting over here writing some rules and get your community right or the people you're dealing with right. Only you, the person who's directly engaging with these unique individuals in this unique time and place, can determine whether what you're doing is bringing out their humanity or not, making them feel included or not. There's no way to do that except to do it, and no way to be sure you're on the right side of the line except to give it your all. And if you're doing that, whether or not you succeed, your actions are in line with the 10 principles. If you're half-assing it, or just following a rote formula, or putting in the minimum effort to get your campmates off your back and your project done, then no, nuh-uh. And that's a very ambiguous standard. I know. It doesn't offer you a list you can check off, or a certificate suitable for framing. And that's the point. An ambiguous line is one that demands actual attention and effort. Anything else is just begging to be gamed. Deep down, you know if you're trying to game the system or not. And having an ambiguous line, having one you have to think about, is the way you keep from doing it. Does that make sense? Okay. Which means that a commitment to the 10 principles is a commitment to live with ambiguity. If we're trying to give people a truly human experience, then we can't know how it's going to turn out in advance. Not for sure. And if we want radical self-expression, then we're never going to be absolutely sure which side of the line we're on. We're going to try to figure it out constantly and repeatedly because it's only natural that we want certainty. But to the extent that the 10 principles require us to sacrifice anything, certainty is it. We just have to live moment to moment, experience to experience. And in some respects, that's never going to make our lives easier. So why would we do that? My God, why? Well, going out to the desert doesn't actually make our lives easier either. We burn because we want our lives to be more fun, more extraordinary, more honest, more full of possibility. Sometimes because we want to change who we are or even the world. We don't want our lives to be easier, we want them to be better. We don't want the world to be easier, we want it to be better. Or pick your own reason. Why do you burn? I can't stand in judgment of it, and I honestly don't care. But you're here. If you're burning, you're giving up no small measure of comfort for no small measure of possibility. The 10 principles help us accomplish that. They are aspirations and guides, but they are not checklists or merit badges. To the extent that they unite us at all, it is in our effort to live up to them, rather than to correctly interpret their content. So, if looking for specific answers generically is not what the 10 principles are for, if that's not their job, then how do we use them? How do they serve us? As an inspiration, as a roadmap? That's the Gesundheit. That's the next side of the question that we have to ask. And I think, once again, that it's important to recognize that while we are not going to get direct answers, well, to be radically inclusive, you do this. Well, to participate, you do that. Beyond be inclusive, participate. There is a tremendous value in thinking about them carefully and deeply. That is a tremendously valuable process, even if it will never yield the kind of right answer that will allow us to stop thinking about them. So, what happens when we do that, when we start thinking deeply about the 10 principles? What is some of the low-hanging fruit that we can see, that we can probably agree on, even if they're never going to be codified? First, I think there's a couple of good general ground rules, that's my term for them, for talking about the 10 principles that more or less make good sense. The first is that the 10 principles are not unlimited goods. That is to say, there is no circumstance in which it is imagined that the world simply can't have too much self-reliance or gifting or self-expression. On the contrary, there is absolutely a time and place to sit down and shut up. In fact, the 10 principles aren't set up in such a way that they are set up in such a way that they actively contradict each other, forcing some kind of give and take to occur. And that give and take is crucial to the process of understanding the 10 principles. They are principles, good ideas, excellent aspirations that we follow. But if you follow them blindly, if you just say, well, whatever the circumstances, self-expression is the answer, immediacy is the answer, leaving no trace is the answer, then again, that's a problem. They're not unlimited goods. If you're following them, following the 10 principles with open eyes keeps you from tripping over them in fairly obvious circumstances. Now, that's not intended to let anyone off the hook. The fact that sometimes self-expression or inclusion are not the answers isn't an excuse for half-assing, and again, that's exactly the point. In fact, I have suggested that following the 10 principles ought to push you out of your comfort zone. Are you being radically self-expressive? Well, how uncomfortable do you feel? Are you being radically inclusive? And I think this is so important, because if we are just extending our gifts and our community and our civic effort to the people we were going to play with all the time anyway, we're not being radically inclusive. It's radical inclusion when it's people you wouldn't otherwise be doing this with. So they ought to push us out of our comfort zone, at least a little, at least some of the time. But as a general rule, there certainly are times and places when just saying, oh, more of this is not the answer, and that's one of the reasons why they are contradictory. They push and pull each other so that you can't simply say, more self-expression, more self-expression, more immediacy, more immediacy. Principles are not dogmas, and they're not meant to justify absolutely anything done in their name. Actually, I probably shouldn't say this, but at a recent Philosophical Center meeting, I had brought up to Larry and Stewart the fact that ISIS has a glossy magazine. They publish a magazine, a lifestyle magazine. And we started joking, and the first question Stewart asked was, well, do they accept advertising? And they don't. And Larry said, well, then it's decommodification. They've got that one. And we started going through it, saying, well, how closely aligned is this with the 10 principles? And on the one hand, you have to accept a certain level of cynicism to say that they follow them at all. But if you're cynical about it, it's remarkably close. And so And so we officially voted on a secret principle to be brought out in times of desperate need. So there is a secret reserve 11th principle, which is if you're following the 10 principles leads you to start killing people, start over. But yeah, there's a time and a place. Similarly to the fact that the 10 principles are not unlimited goods, that they're not always the answer to every situation, they're not exclusive goods either. They are meant to describe the principles of Burning Man, not to encompass everything that is right and good in the universe. Let us agree right here and now that Burning Man is not the only prism through which the world can or should be viewed, and that there are many good and important things that are not especially relevant to burner culture. I've always felt that patience is a virtue. That doesn't mean it needs to be one of the 10 principles. Humility is crucial to one's character. That doesn't mean we need to find a way to squeeze it into Burning Man's core values. Knowledge of history is important. People should understand how the internet works. It's good to speak a second language. Burning Man, however, has little to say about any of this, and that's okay. I don't mean that individual burners don't have anything to say about this. I mean, doctrinally speaking, formally speaking, that's not important to making Burning Man Burning Man. The 10 principles don't have to settle any issues between theists and atheists. They don't have to be the springboard to a global peace accord, and they cannot mandate that the farmers and the cowboys should be friends. If Burning Man is your only worldview, then you're going to miss most of the world, and that would be a shame. Burning Man is a good thing. It's an important thing. It might very well change the world, but it will never be the world in that sense. And so the 10 principles will never be enough on their own to cover any and every eventuality of life. The 10 principles are not exclusive goods. Burning Man's principles are good principles, but it doesn't claim there can't be any other principles for individuals or groups in the world. Burning Man has insights, good insights, but it doesn't claim that you don't need any others. The 10 principles, after all, are fundamentally a means to an end. It's actually changing now. I have met people who have said, well, I was really attracted to Burning Man first because I read about your 10 principles and those really spoke to me, and so I came in. But I don't think that's true for most of us. The vast majority of us, I don't think, came to Burning Man because he said, you know what I need is 10 really good principles. That would be great. We came to Burning Man because either we knew somebody amazing and they were like, hey, come do this thing with me. And we're like, well, you're amazing, so sure, I'll try your thing. Or because we saw some people doing something utterly, ridiculously incredible and said, I want to do that. Can I help? Actually, I really do think that the purest expression of Burning Man culture is when you see somebody doing something absolutely ridiculous and amazing and say, can I help? I mean, I really think that right there is sort of the essence of it. But you use the 10 principles to get to burning. But following the 10 principles, while it helps, it is a roadmap. They are stars that lead you there, but following them isn't identical to burning. It's not synonymous with it. It is possible, fucked up, but still possible, to follow the 10 principles in such a way that people will look at you and think, what an asshole, and not want to play with you. And if that's your problem, then no amount of saying, oh yeah, but I'm self-reliant, is going to help. I leave less of a trace than you. Not helpful. I think that in many ways then, the best way to use the 10 principles was actually told to me at a global leadership conference a number of years ago by Los Angeles regional rep Athena, when she said that whenever a project she's working on isn't working, the best thing she can do is to ask herself what principles are missing here and try to figure out how they can bring it in. If something isn't working, am I letting people express themselves? Am I being inclusive enough? Are there enough opportunities for people to participate? Is this not relevant to our community? Is it not civically minded? Is everybody's experience of it too delayed? That asking yourself those questions is a great way to bring something back on track, to get it oriented towards Burning Man as you move towards it. Which is to say that the principles are best used when they are questions to be asked. Radical inclusion is at its most effective, not when you're trying to check boxes off a list. Yep, doing that, being inclusive, but when you're asking yourself, how can I be more inclusive? Participation is at its most effective as a principle, not when you're saying, is everybody getting at least 4 hours in? Great, good, there, got it. But when you're asking yourself, how can we encourage more participation? The best use of the 10 principles is as a question that you ask yourself, or that your community asks yourself, to see what other opportunities there are, or what might be missing. That way, no matter where you are, no matter what you're doing, you're looking for ways to create the conditions in which even more burning can happen. Again, using them as questions forces you to get off your ass. It forces you to throw yourself into it, rather than saying, hey, look at me, 10 principles, great. The tension and contradiction in the principles becomes increasingly fruitful when you ask yourself, how can you bring them all into what you do, rather than to expect us to tell them, or expect them to tell us what you should be doing. You ask the questions, and if the answers contradict themselves, and they often will, how can I let people express themselves more? How can I let people feel more included? Not always a good balance. But when they contradict themselves, you then have to think about it. You're then actually asking yourself, okay, what's possible here? And you take the ones that feel the most like Burning Man to you, that get you to burning, that create the most burning. And then, when you're done, you ask them again from where you are now. And again, we come back to the fact that you don't stop, that you never stop. You keep asking and learning and changing, and that is the point. And that's me. That's what I got to say. Thank you. Thank you. I'd now like to ask Ian and Misha, who have quite literally worked with Burning Man communities all over the world, quite possibly some of yours, to talk about what you think the 10 principles have been effectively used or badly used in some of the communities you've worked with, examples that you've seen. By the way, we have not rehearsed this. Ironically, we have so half-assed it.
So, in the spirit of immediacy, I just immediately composed a response to caveat, as well as a few things about 10 principles in general. So I hope I'm honoring this principle by ad-libbing this talk, tapping it out on this phone.
Nice save.
At the same time thinking about immediacy, I was actually once accused a year or two ago, by a new community member of violating immediacy. What could that mean? How does one practice immediacy? How is immediacy something that's quantifiable? How can one cross that line or not cross that line? And it got me thinking, what does immediacy or any of these principles mean in English? And something that I, Misha, other regionals in this room might be thinking about is how we translate ideas like immediacy, participation, and so on into other languages. The one I'm usually working with is Chinese. Immediacy is hard enough in English. How on earth to exactly convey that same sensibility in a language that's different as Chinese? Especially for people who have never been to Black Rock City, who may not have been to your regional events, and people who are curious and have some kind of sensation of that experience. And of course, as everyone knows, and it's probably absurd about at length, we had a regional network before we had 10 principles, and we had a Black Rock City before we had 10 principles, and we had regional events before we had 10 principles. Caveats descriptive, not prescriptive. They're meant to describe the way the cultures emerge, not to tell you what to do. I think, that's probably a healthy way to go about things, yet he and anyone who works with words for a living knows that words don't just describe things, but they actually do things. Words happen in the world. These words and these principles, they both generate and minimize ambiguity. They're perhaps unlimited goods and are unquantifiable, yet they're also paradoxical caveats, I guess, and I think that's pretty reasonable. The more you break the rules, the more you're doing them right. And by that measure, the Burning Man organization is both the greatest practitioner and violator of those principles. Radical inclusion? Well, we all know about ticket scarcity. Many of us in this room have flown in that are underspent and still not have tickets to Black Rock City, right? This is an interesting tension that the organization works with, and yet, despite that, this room is full. Decommodification? Well, some people's labor power is financially compensated, but the vast majority is not. Labor, again, is a kind of a commodity form in a sense. And as for immediacy, anyone who's tried to get anything immediately done with the Burning Man organization, well, you might have your own opinion. Yeah. But what's that mean for those of us in this room? Clearly, we're here for a reason. We work with these principles. We work with events. We work with communities in all kinds of ways. And we talk about educating. We talk about training. We talk about leadership. Some of us have the linguistic luxury to cut and paste these 10 principles. And then they'll find that, like in the case of LA, maybe to add an 11th principle, gratitude or something else, they can take this kind of additive approach. For others who are working in Czech or in Chinese or in Japanese or in Spanish or other languages, we find ourselves having to translate or reinterpret these principles. And we find ourselves in a position in which we set up context for not only the reproduction of the experience that these principles were designed to describe or capture, but also allow openings for new forms of connection that both work with and beyond them. And so as a way of opening a conversation, both that honors and violates its own origin, which I think is the fundamental tension that underlies what Fabiat was just saying, I'd like to give a descriptive and dare I say, a prescriptive direction here, and shift this conversation from something like radical self-expression to not just translation or copying or cutting and pasting these 10 principles, but actually reinterpretation. And again, not just in a radical sense or a self-expressive sense, but in a collective sense. So kind of shift this from a radical self-expression and a participation in that to something more like a transgressive collective reinterpretation. And from that, I'd like to hand this to Misha.
No pressure.
I would like to continue on this note, and if you wait, and I will bring more clarity into this, you're thinking wrong. I would like to ask first, whose mother language is not like the first language, is not English?
Whoa.
Okay. And who is also like who is international? I think it's our city. Oh, yeah. Cool. So imagine that, like you've heard now the opinions and how the guys see how difficult it is to understand the principles and how to describe them. And imagine that you're coming to the principles in a different language than you're used to, than you actually are living with, than that you grow up with. And also that you're coming from a different culture. For example, I come from Czech Republic, so it's Czech Republic and Eastern Europe, making the history of many years of communism. So talking about civic responsibility and communal effort and gifting is really fucking hard way and very violently. They were forced on people for 40 years in my country. So when you open this theme up, it's just like, wow, red flag, like, stop. What is this? What are you telling me? Where did you go? Oh my God, did they brainwash you? And I'm like, no, let's talk. Like, step back. Like, forget what you lived in, what you grew up in. Forget what you know and listen. And I'm trying to explain, and it's not easy. So it's not only that like we all are wrapping our heads around these principles, but then in English and it's what we know here. But then we also have to realize, oh, there are other groups who doesn't understand the language, who doesn't understand the culture, who doesn't understand the background where this is coming from, or they have completely different backgrounds where this means different things. You know, there are cultures where if you burp while you're eating, it's very rude. And there are cultures, if you don't burp, it's really rude that you didn't. And how would you know? Sometimes you don't know these things, and it needs just like to be like there needs to be openness and kind of generosity in the things like how to approach things. So even more, this cannot be doctrine because I need to describe some principles in a completely different way than they are described. And for example, for a long time, I couldn't touch it. I couldn't translate it into my language because I didn't know how. I know the words, I know the meaning, I know what it means, but I couldn't. And it took a few years until I met somebody else, a group of people from UK, who actually translated principles of Burning Man into easy English. And then I was like, oh, I didn't think about it. Because these principles are crafted over 20 years, and every word is really like polished and on the right spot. You know, it makes sense. It's kind of like perfect. And when you wanna translate it in this like perfect sentence and the sense, you're trapped. It's trapped. So first you have to translate it for yourself into something else, and then you can maybe translate it into your own language and your own culture. This is the same with, I cannot translate Burning Man into Czech language because we have historical connection and context, but everyone immediately thinks about one guy who, as a political protest, burned himself in the middle of Prague when he was a very young student at the university. And it was his self-expression on freedom and against the structure which was in my country. So I don't even try to translate that because it's impossible. So this was my adding to this complicated talk about principles, what it means and how they are used. Because the name of this talk is also like using them as a blueprint. Well, I cannot really use them as a blueprint because these blueprints, we cannot read them. We need different color. We need black prints. I don't know, we need something else to understand it. So that's my addition to this, and now is time for questions and how do you feel about this? How this settled in your brains? What are your questions? What are your additions to this?
Actually, if I could just two things that occurred to me during Ian and Misha's remarks. One of which goes back to the original title that I had wanted to give this. The 10 principles will not help you win an argument with the Shirkotan DJ you help so much, but they will help you collaborate with him. That I think is sort of where it comes down in terms of using them in your community. And in that sense, Ian might actually know more about this than I do, but there's a concept from Mahayana Buddhism that I'm very fond of called skillful means, which is, if I'm understanding it correctly, that in order to tell someone the truth or give them enlightenment, you have to be where they're at. you have to talk in a way that will make sense to them. And I suspect that's exactly right in terms of what we're hearing here, that it simply does no good to throw the 10 principles at people, that you really do have to meet them where they are, and because if it doesn't work for them, then it's just not going to work. That fundamentally that interpretive process is absolutely crucial. That's what I got. So yeah, we have a spare mic here, so who would like to, yes? You have to turn it on, it's not on yet. Oh, you turned it on, never mind.
Hello.
There we go.
Ian, if you could also address cultural interpretation of the 10 principles.
Could you give me a more specific direction there?
You are in East Asia, a totally different culture from the Western culture here in the United States. 10 principles comes from a Christian-based ethos, one could argue. How do you have difficulty, or are there issues that you've encountered with cultural interpretation of the 10 principles in East Asia?
Sure. Is Matt here? Yeah. And I think that's something that came up at our Asia Summit last May that I didn't even consider. It's not a question that's come up for me in Taiwan or in China, but it was an issue for you and the Japan Burn organizers was decommodification. I recall a discussion that for other kinds of organizations that practice something akin to decommodification, or at least the way it was rendered into Japanese, that when money was transformed in a way such that it wasn't that the members of the community weren't able to engage in commerce in the same way within that community as they would without it. It appeared to be particularly cultish and dangerous. In Japan, and not just in Japan, in the States, a number of quasi-religious groups require people to turn over all of their money, all of their control over production to a guru, to a leader, to a bureaucracy. And that this is particularly threatening in a place like Japan. In China, any kind of organization that's not infiltrated or under the overview of the party state in some way is also possibly a threat. So when these principles start butting against these very different kinds of political and economic values, they have to absolutely be reinterpreted. So that's not just a cultural interpretation issue, it's also just respecting the different ecosystems that these communities are evolving in. So I'd say I wouldn't assume that the 10 principles, as we articulate them, are coming necessarily from a Judeo-Christian foundation. In fact, I'd say in many ways the 10 principles have more in mind with Mahayana Buddhism. I mean, the ideas of leaving no trace, the ideas of impermanence that the burn itself celebrates, and in some ways are more naturally aligned with very different kinds of theologies and metaphysics. That having been said, simply grafting or cutting and pasting 10 principles to China, Taiwan, Korea, Japan doesn't work as well. So again, just honoring that there's a tension, yet a kind of a fundamental creative reinterpretive process at every step of the way is something that anyone's going to do. Be that in East Asia, Australia, South Africa, or San Francisco.
Hello, my name is Nexus from BC. More comment than question, and I really appreciate just this conversation and looking at the principles in terms of this personal inquiry. I guess I just want to call out something you kind of mentioned before, like principle shaming, when people use principles to judge other burners. And as someone who's camped in Pennsylvania, I've been sometimes naively surprised, and I've heard from some of my friends and acquaintances that people who camp at burners and rest camping are somehow less than because their selection of transportation isn't as self-reliant when some of the folks burn as bright as anyone else. So I just wanted to call that out, and maybe when things like that happen, that can be an opportunity to have and elevate this conversation.
Could I actually? Yeah, if this isn't 10 principles specifically, but I would. Fuck. Just when it was going so well. But who told you?
You actually requested this heckling.
I did.
I brought a posse, so good luck with the rest
Ah,
of you.
yeah.
We're radically intruding
This
ourselves.
Join our radical self
I love you so much.
That's not enough.
But
I don't feel your love. Will the love carry on?
Where's my gift?
best hecklers ever.
We'll be here for a little while.
But no, it's just great. No, it's just great.
Go ahead.
When I was never really a costume person, and so I went out to my first couple of burns with no real costuming to speak of, and what I would periodically encounter were people who would ride by on bikes going, "Hey, nice costume, asshole," and that did not help. And I don't just mean that it made me think less of the people who did it in Burning Man culture by extension, but it also put me off costuming. And since I have learned through my own experiences that no, actually it's a lot more fun if you do that. It has nothing to do with peacocking or what have you. It's actually just more fun. They probably put an extra year or two on my figuring that out. So that kind of thing is radically unhelpful. And yeah, I completely agree that when you feel like somebody is doing it wrong, then unless you just want to say, "Hey, you're doing it wrong," which is always okay, but the correct response is to invite them to play. I've said in another context, and I think this is fundamentally true, that Burning Man culture expands if we meet 3 criteria. One, if we're having more fun than everybody else. 2, if that fun is good for people in a way that is meaningful to them. That is, we don't have to tell them what they're getting out of it, but as long as they are getting something out of it that is meaningful to them. And 3, that anybody can play. And as long as we're doing that, we're going to expand. We don't need to proselytize. We win. But if we take any of those out, and I think shaming people for what are really just their basic humanity, they're just doing what they're doing, that does not help. Yeah, sorry. Next person. Next, who's got the mic now?
I get the mic.
Great.
Hey, Chicago. There's one, the problem I ran into at Midburn, I'm sorry? It is on, I think, is it?
Yeah, it's on.
Okay, Midburn. So I go to Midburn, all set up. I got my camp all figured out and everything. Dragging around a suitcase with an art project and all my clothes. I can't find my freaking camp because all the signage is in Hebrew. So is it me being radically self-reliant and not learning Hebrew, or being radically self-reliant and not asking for directions, or is it the signage not being inclusive? So anyway, eventually that was a strange thing that I ran into. The other thing about the costume, one of the things that drives me nuts is the pink furry leggings, which you buy on Amazon. It's like during the 60s, if you were a hippie, there was an official hippie uniform, with the suede jacket, blue. And rather than make fun of people, I made a whole series of other pants that instead of having fur, have lizards or bells or army men or any number of things. And again, by example, if a 60-year-old fart can sew on things, how hard is it?
No, I think that's it exactly. I think I'm not particularly fond of burner fashion, but the appropriate response, if it's really bothering you, is to make better fashion. Yeah, absolutely. As for not being able to read the signs in Hebrew in Israel, there I think you're on your own. It's just, would work too.
Well, I couldn't find an exit to Midburn. We had to take 3 hours detour because we didn't know that the sign we see is the entrance sign.
We're settling some old scores now, apparently. Who's got the mic?
Hi, Heather from Vancouver. I'm a city councilor, and I love comparing Black Rock City to downtown Vancouver. It's something I've sort of gotten a bit fetishist about it. And when I think about the 10 principles, I think about not laws, but policies. The policies of Black Rock City. And really good policies enable more than they restrict and are non-prescriptive. And so I've really been having a lot of fun with that. And I look at our city policies and I kind of line them up against the 10 principles. And sometimes I think maybe we need to tweak. We haven't allowed
That's fantastic. Yeah, Larry likes to say that, pass the microphone to somebody else. We've got some people over here, that we can't expect people to be better than they are. And I think that's fundamentally right. And I think from a city policy standpoint, you don't make policies that you can't possibly expect someone to actually work with. And I think in that sense, if there's not room for our humanity within the 10 principles, then we're doing it wrong.
So one of the principles that I think is fundamentally different for regionals versus Big Burn and Gerlach is radical inclusion. Because it's one thing to say it says that there's no prerequisites exist to participate in our community. And that's one thing to do once a year, but it's another thing when you have a regional community where you're going to see that person every week at the meet and greet, and they're going to be out at your event, and it's going to be an ongoing relationship. So does radical inclusion include racists? Does it include people who may have a felony conviction for sexual assault, even if they've never done anything at a burn? Where do you draw that line?
That is one of the most difficult, challenging aspects of it, and I'm going to tell you right now that there isn't a comfortable answer. There isn't a simple way that we do this. The first thing I would say is you do your best, and at some level, nobody who's not on the ground really has a right to say, hey, But my strong sense about radical inclusion is that it cannot mean we leave radical inclusion cannot mean letting your brains go. It cannot mean letting your own moral judgments go. There's this asinine sense that radical inclusion means never judging anybody or anything. And that basically reduces us all to moral zombies. At that point, a prerequisite for entering in our community is leaving your brains behind. Well, no thank you. I wouldn't want to belong to that community. So, on the one hand, I think radical inclusion means that we do have to offer space to people to the extent that we can. That as uncomfortable as it is for us, and it should be uncomfortable for us, we have to say that we are not going to chase somebody out because they hold beliefs that are despicable for us. But at the same time, we do not have to approve of those beliefs, nor do we have an excuse not to mitigate the harm that they're doing. And therein, I think, the question, that's the tension there. Can we make space for them? Maybe. But maybe, should we try? Absolutely. But at some point, if it's not working, it's not working. And at that point, radical inclusion is not an unlimited good. At that point, you never know where that is until you actually try to do it. I guess I would say, and this is my best advice, and God bless you, do whatever works, is try to include them to a point where it makes you uncomfortable. But at that point, if it's not working, it's not working. And you do what you have to do. Is that helpful? Is that, yeah?
Yeah, I think that's kind of how we're approaching it. We joke about having a principle of radical exclusion as well. So it wants to create that tension, right? It's
Yeah.
the point where you don't continue blindly following.
Right. I see a radical loophole. I see double hands there.
Well, just to throw out there that it goes back to the balance, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you're balancing radical inclusion against civic responsibility,
Right.
which is the safety of the community and,
Right.
and the communal effort that everybody comes together and looks out for each other.
Right. Absolutely. Flip it then blue.
And radical inclusion means part of that is creating a safe space for people, and if it's a choice between having to violate that on one person who's going to create an unsafe space or making it excluding people who aren't in a safe, can't join the community because it's not safe, you miss on one instead of miss on 500, So radical inclusion includes keeping a safe space that's safe for everyone to be in. If someone's making it unsafe,
Blue?
I was just going to throw out, I heard the words in good standing, and I don't know how they apply in everybody's community. I'm not sure how they apply on the fly. Really, there's 70,000 people. I don't know how you, is our gate that good?
Yes.
Yeah, I should just, okay, double hands.
Yes, double hands. I'm Treat from Transformers, and we have a phrase that we believe is a valid exception to radical inclusion, and that phrase is, as community sacred duty to protect our community. And so we feel like we evaluate any circumstance, any potential threat, any person coming in by that standard. If that person represents a significant, realistic threat to our community, then that's the standard we judge to put aside the principle of inclusion and say, in this case, no. So protection of the community is the 4 words that are operative for us.
What kind of threat?
For instance, the case of a sexual predator. Perhaps performed by another bird of somebody's activities at another bird. And we feel like that represents a significant threat to our community.
Sure, I think that's, easier, not to interrupt you, I think
Right, sure.
that's a case that I think most people in this room would agree about. I just wondered if you had it defined.
Not liking somebody is not sufficient, okay? Feeling icky about somebody is not sufficient. That's why we use the 4 words, protection of the community. If it doesn't qualify as protection of the community, then radical inclusion.
I see thank you. I see a hand here.
I just want to put out there something I've been talking about community about because we live in an area where this is a discussion for us as a budding community. And there's a lot of judgment on the word judgment. We've all spent decades cultivating our good judgment. That's what brought us here.
Yeah. No, I'm two thoughts, and then this is to this discussion. These are discussion points for this. Okay. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Mike Insane, and DPW 11 years, been burning people about 13 years. Moving more out into the world, doing other events, and when I go to those events, I like to try to instill some of the 10 principles without reciting them as law. And to Nisha's comments about translating them into other languages, I spent a lot of time in Central America, and it has come to mind more than once. Anywhere in the Vernerverse has the 10 principles been interpreted in one or more places into one or more languages, or even within English itself? There's many cultures within English speaking, in the English speaking world. So I just wonder, is there any place or places that anyone knows of, or you can say, oh yeah, we've translated those into Spanish, we have translated those into my native language?
You've got exactly the right people here.
I collected so far 18 different languages, translations of the 10 principles into 18 different languages. 4 of them are from Africa, like for example, Greece, Japan, Russia, Czech, what do we have? Dutch, Finnish. There is many translations that we are trying. Now currently Hungarians are trying to translate. So
Are they collected somewhere together, where we could key them and access them, and other people that are reading those?
that is being worked on. Yes, the PhD we were figuring out how to put it out there so actually other people with this abilities, language abilities, can comment and maybe suggest some other suggestions for the translation. So we are figuring this out, how to put it out there. If you want that, I can share. It's not a problem.
Well,
It's not a secret. It's a different language.
Exactly. Especially like Spanish, we've got one Latin American word. Have they translated the 10 principles into Spanish for the Argentinian regional? Do they have those? Do the foreign, regionals all have their own version?
This is interesting because, for example, there was different translation into German language in Germany and in Austria.
And,
Can you talk about passports, maybe?
I think they're on the alternate.
I can definitely make sure about that.
each also noted that there's different translations into English as well. For every speaking to English, and points to how languages themselves are ambiguous anyway. But we have all that on shared folders that could go eventually onto the website.
This is very much a work in progress. Yeah.
Caveat, you fucker.
Get out of here!
This course is too damn good to heckle.
Never, don't say that, never say that. Can flip it, everybody, yes. Give it up for our hecklers, yes.
So, we made Japanese version of the principles last year, and also we asked a group of foreigners in Japan to translate back in English in simpler details. You know, we have to explain what it is to those who live in Japan, but foreigners in Japan cannot be able to do anything. So it's like 8-year-old kid trying to explain principles to adults. So there's English version and Japanese version on Learning Japan website. And you also know it gets funky when you translate back and forth. So if you're interested, please check and when something sounds funny, just let me know.
Yeah, there's a real tension between wanting to get it right on the one hand and wanting to get out of people's way on the other and let them do whatever helps them get to where we're all trying to go. And it's very much a work in progress.
I can't wait to run Google Translate the 10 principles out 6 times and then back into English.
And then whatever that is, we do that. Yeah. Yeah.
Clem or originally on from Hawaii, but also converting it into Hawaiian terms. Everybody knows aloha, which means I love you, hello, and goodbye. One thing you might be confused is mahalo doesn't mean trash. It means thank you. A lot of tourists see that on a trash receptacle and think. Even in the English, converting into the Queen's English or West End London English, that it can go anywhere. So we're working on the Hawaiian regional, and we're going to get it up.
So give the mic to somebody, and I will ask Tony to. What do you got?
Oh, well, I've been doing some writing lately about Burning Man, starting in '96, before the principles were actually words. And just by recalling some of the stories of events and the experience being in Burning Man in those days, you find out that the principles were attacked all along. And they didn't need this people just were naturally being inclusive, and naturally having a communal feel, and naturally being self-reliant. And there's been times of the few regionals that I've been to, I've actually seen a lot of championing of the principles, where they're actually on signs as you're entering the place, almost like commandments, or almost like something that you recite so many times that you kind of don't even know what you're saying anymore. And I think that's what I always thought that was one of the dangers, is to over recite them and not really understand what they mean anymore when you're actually just being human. You naturally want to live that way anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and my feeling, of course, is if you're not grappling with them at some level, then you're not engaging with them. Yeah. Recitation is the enemy. Who has the mic now?
I do. Back here.
Okay, then back here and we'll work our way up.
Is this on? Doesn't sound like it.
It's on.
Yes?
Are you even a burner?
And now that I'm no longer with the organization, I'll tell you what I don't like about the 10 principles.
Holding it in for years.
No, I've been waiting for a while. No, I'm kidding. Somewhat. No, I want to follow on exactly what Coyote said. That's a good segue into what I was going to bring up, which is the fact that, yes, my problem with the 10 principles is that they are descriptive and not prescriptive, in the sense that they are a description of a particular people in a particular place at a particular time. And that context is extraordinarily unique. And the cultural magic that came out of that is unique to that place in a lot of ways. And the fact that it has that ecosystem that supports it makes that possible. And we've since taken those principles, and the community has taken those principles, and turned them into a prescriptive kind of consciousness around, and
that's where your principle shaming comes into place, and you turn them into commandments, and everything we've been discussing here. And that's where things do get dangerous. And we took them to mean, like, this is how the Burning Man organization should act, which isn't necessarily the case. Like, that's not, you wouldn't normally run an efficient, effective business based on what you see in the 10 principles. There's a lot in there that does make sense, and a lot of stuff that you should be, considering and holding it up as a touchstone for what you do, and to understand whether what you're doing is authentic. But to use those as a blueprint, as a one-to-one blueprint about how you should act as a business, is just not going to translate properly. And it's it's caused Burning Man a lot, it's hamstrung us in our ability to function as effectively as we can in the world. And I don't like how that's played out exactly. I do like the idea of the caveat, the way caveat looks at them, I think is exactly right, which is as a method of inquiry, as that touchstone for, is what I'm doing proper and authentic and the best I can be doing in the world? Because ultimately, the question of whether they're Buddhist or Christian is kind of neither here nor there, because they are basic principles for living a good life and being a good person, being decent in the world. And that's the basic underpinning of any religion, whether or not you are, whether there's a physical God out there that you think exists or whatever. This is just a good way to live and be in the world. And so I encourage you guys, as you consider how to map the principles to your world, don't do it too hard. Because if you do it too hard, it's going to break, and people are going to call bullshit on you and say, well, that's really nice, and sure, that sounds good, but it's not really practical for me. And that's where the culture is going to start to get brittle, right? And so I encourage everybody to consider them as just that method of inquiry, that touchstone, that idea of, can I live up to this as best I can? But don't hold yourself to that level of perfection that makes it that otherwise creates failure out of your attempt to be successful. And in terms of like translating them, by the way, not to be a pedantic mansplainer asshole, I'm going to do this anyway. Everybody seems to have the wrong understanding of what immediacy is. So before you start to translate them, and when you think about them, please let's get immediacy right. It's not doing something now and wait rather than waiting. That's not what immediacy is. It's actually, think about it as disintermediation, right? The opposite of disintermediation. So do not have anything between you and your immediate experience. So in other words, don't be looking through a phone, looking at your world through a phone or through something that's intermediating it for you and giving it some sort of translation. Have that authentic, it's about authentic, direct, immediate experience here and now in this room, you and me talking to each other and not talking across the screen. So just wanted to clear that up.
Yeah.
It's important because it's other than radical in my mind, other than radical inclusion, it's the most important principle because it's the one about having these conversations of human being to human being that are so rare and precious in our world in an overly corporatized and media, intermediated world. The more that we can have these conversations, the more we will advance ourselves, our culture as human beings. So, thank you.
Yeah, immediacy is not instant gratification. Two totally different things. There were some people in, yeah. Okay, next.
So I want to actually follow through with that because I definitely feel the difficulties based on what you were just saying. And so I'm in, so Burning Man is an ephemeral place. It's about building the kind of ideal city you want to be in. And I work in urban revitalization, real estate development, and I work with philanthropic investors and developers actually, which are corporations, that really have a sincere interest in replicating those principles into the real world, into the developed world. But it's very difficult because they're businesses, they're corporations, and there's business transactions. And the more permanent you get, the more businesses are necessary. Restaurants, everything, the hotel, where you live, it's all permanent, all built largely by corporations and government. But the more you talk about how do we actually make this happen, the more I feel a little bit of the subconscious principle shame that I can't go there because I'm violating the decommodification principle.
Yeah. Are you following our blog series, Art, Money, and the Renaissance?
I'm about to do that after watching the talk with you guys.
Great. That is exactly what we're talking about there. And send me a note, caveat@burningman.org. Tell me what you're thinking. Let's be part of that discussion. Absolutely.
Neil from DC.
Great. Thank you.
Blue, you don't need a mic, do you? Get up there.
I just was going to say, based on what Will was talking about, the principle is immediacy, not immediately, and he's very, very right about that. I also didn't know if this would fit in, but after he said that, I didn't really know very much about the principles in 2005. I thought they were already written down in 2001 when I went to apply the first time, because that's the way it felt like when I was in Black Rock City my first time. And then I got to start working with people in the office in San Francisco. My name's Blue. I work full-time in the office in San Francisco, facilities manager. And I got the opportunity to sit down with Marion Goodell on my couch back in 2005 at my house and talk with her a lot. And not really knowing why I answered the question this way, she asked me at one point, "You're in this for the long haul, aren't you?" And I answered her, "Is there any other way to be in it?" And again, really not knowing why I even answered it that way, it's exactly what I felt. I got just chills on my back saying it again. It goes back to what Kavi was saying when he was speaking in the very beginning about, and I think this is immediacy, is if you're going to do this with people, if you're going to go down this road with people and be a part of this type of community, you owe everyone and you are owed yourself the respect to be in that space of immediacy and be present and work with people and look them in the eye and be in it, all the way in it. And for the long haul, I keep struggling with that one. Do I get to stop at any time? I told Marion I was going to for the long haul. When Will Chase, I was in Europe when Will Chase announced that he was leaving, and I was like, oh my God, Will Chase leaving. Does he know something I don't know?
Secret chamber,
All right, you've been waiting very patiently. Do you need a mic?
No.
Okay.
I'm Dina from Texas. In Texas, we suffer from people who only practice the principles at a burn, which has been very difficult for me. And I don't know if you've heard that kind of talk before, part-time vocational burners. I try to teach, and I tell them that it's very fluid. And to answer the question about radical inclusion, inclusion,
yeah.
include everybody in, one of the things that this comes up all the time, and I always say that you can also practice being a radical self-reliant and keep yourself out of danger from these people. It's your duty to do that as yourself. So these are very fluid and they work, and I like the way you say that they work with and against each other. So I just wanted to do that. And I don't know how to dress part-time burners, I really don't.
Yeah.
For example, in Latvia, they transformed radical inclusion into each one.
Let's go again.
Each person, each another person. Sorry. Each one. And that's the inclusion they practice.
Yeah, I mean, my hope is, the way that I like to think of this ideally working, is that part-time burners are at least getting that exposure, and if we are having more fun in the default world too, they'll come around eventually. In the meantime, it's a son of a bitch. Who's next? Yes, please.
Gandhi from Houston, and I don't remember where I heard it or how long ago, but I remember hearing principles described as the shortest, simplest set of rules we can all agree on for doing stuff together and having fun doing. We don't teach them as prescriptive in Houston when we enculturate our newbies. They're not rules, they're not laws, they're values, and that makes it a lot easier to navigate the balancing act, because values require balance.
Yeah. I want to check, because we've forgotten. How long does this go? 5:15? Okay, good. We've got a little more time. Questions? I'll just say them to ignite discussion a bit more. In terms of working with difficult people, the radical inclusion discussion, I've never been really comfortable with thinking about Burning Man as a safe space. That's always bothered me. And
It's here to keep you safe. The war on drugs is to keep you safe. War on terrorism is to keep you
it's,
safe.
I mean, I think I guess I would, and I understand why people want to think of it that way, and I understand the function that a safe space provides. But I think that what makes Burning Man so powerful is precisely that people take risks. And I think that those risks, by definition, can't be safe. Otherwise, they're not really risks, and otherwise there's nothing really at stake. For me, this all works precisely because it's real, because something is at stake. And so in that sense, instead of safe spaces, I like to think of it as a place where risks are lubricated. And where in response, it is very easy to get back up if you fall down. That if you fail, there are a bunch of people who are going to go, well, hey, let's help, let's do it again, let's figure this out. No, it's okay, you were amazing when you tried. And maybe there'll be some people on a bullhorn going, hey, asshole, you just fell down. But there you'll be surrounded by people trying to get you back up. And to me, that's much more profound than a safe space. And I think it's closer to the magic, but I could be wrong. Yeah.
On that issue,
Can you do a 180?
But the safety in numbers, I think, is kind of what I think about it. And as like computer scientists and working with some AI stuff, everything like that, we think about the natural world and model a lot of stuff off that, like flocking behavior. You think about being in a school of fish or a school of like birds, you feel safe in that flock, you know. But the only course direction that you change and to take you out of safety or to learn a new direction is that first bird that gets out in front and guides the rest of the flock. And that's kind of a tension that I'm seeing between the safety thing and like there's a whole bunch of people who guide a flock. You know, if it happens on all these different scales too, on the entire burning community, but also in a more sexual like play space or whatever.
Yeah.
There's a flocking behavior, you know, when someone is out of line and they touch someone else. That one first bird or fish or depending on what their costume is, flocks in and changes the course of the direction and save it for the safety in numbers of the entire flock. I think that's a neat way to kind of model it.
I like that. Yeah. Yeah, I would also say that if somebody says to me, I don't feel safe, then you're damn right you've got my attention. I mean, that's, the other side of that. Did you?
Somebody there. Right here.
Okay.
I think that radical inclusion doesn't mean safe space for people. It means welcoming everybody to be dangerous with us.
Who else? Yes.
You're next, Coyote. Oh, okay. You don't need a mic. I'm Coyote. I'm the site manager at Black Rock City. Also, as of late, I've been put in a very interesting position of being the in-house ocean trainer. If you can imagine. Now, some of the people that I was with DPW with the Days of Old found out this news and they're laughing on me for it. You are the ocean trainer? we did things quite, I said we had safety third for quite a while. We were proud of safety third. But I do remember the morning after the burn in '96 where 4 people lost their lives. And I do remember the very serious conversation, I think you were there, Michael, very serious conversation that we were having about how we were going to move forward with this event, since how we had created a place that, and created an example that others were trying to follow our lead and weren't doing it as safely as we did. One of the things that we had back in those days were things like drive-by shooting ranges and so on. And one of the things I wrote this here tonight was these were the safest, most dangerous people I'd ever met. And we hold that truth. There's always been a tension in our event. For instance, those kerosene lanterns or kerosene cannons and whatnot. The most dangerous thing that ever happened at Burning Man is one of the most championed photographs that sits on the wall in the office. The wedge is a good example. It's the most fun thing I've ever tried, and it injured the most people. So the grapple with this because I'm teaching staff members that have grown up with Burning Man. And so what I'm trying to teach is a culture of safety in numbers and flocks, watch each other's backs. I mean, the Empire State Building was built in 13 months without any safety stuff at all, and one steel worker died. They all had each other's backs. And so one thing in my class, I'm trying to bring it to OSHA, is to put safety second anyway. We'll never make safety first.
No, and actually, maybe there is a sense in communal effort and civic responsibility that we haven't fully grokked yet, that means watching out for each other's backs. We got to have that. I don't know. Yes?
You mentioned before LA, the 11th principle of gratitude.
I think it was Ian, but yeah.
I heard you earlier.
I think that was Ian, but yeah.
Sorry. I know people got arguments over whether it's gratitude or consent, and they're fuckery. Too much. When there's arguments over, like, where do you go to the conversation?
Mhm.
And the second part is personally for you. What would, if you could pick one principle, what would it be?
Getting red.
Yeah, probably Doom. Yeah, Doom. Doom. That was an in joke. It's been interesting to me as different communities have come up with different 11th or even 12th principles. What does this mean? I mean, what is this? I sort of reflexively, like I was saying, I don't think every good quality in the world needs to be put in Burning Man's 10 principles. I think it's perfectly acceptable to have good things in the world that are not 10 principles of Burning Man. But I think there's something happening here that we should pay attention to. My sense is that when a community says, hey, this is an 11th principle for us, what they're saying isn't like, hey, we've discovered a new law of physics. It's more like, this is something that our community needs to get to burning. And maybe for LA, home of everybody wants to direct, that's gratitude. And if you don't get to if your community doesn't have an injection of gratitude, you have a problem with burning. And for other communities, it's a consent issue because they have consent issues. And if they don't address that and they say, hey, this is a part of what we do, then they're not going to get to burning because people won't feel comfortable enough. And I think that's a very valuable and important process. And so in that sense, I don't think that an 11th principle or what have you is necessarily Burning Man wide, but I do think it's very vital for local communities to be able to take stock like that and say, hey, this is what we need. And we should not be going, no, you don't really need that. No, if they're saying they need that, they need that. So the way, getting back, I think what you're asking is, what is my 11th principle? And it's going to be whatever's going to get me into more costumes, I think, honestly. And I don't know quite what that is yet, but it's got to do that. Yes, sir.
Relating back to safety again, I think the safety is just like the 10 principles. They're all situationally applied. And, there's a different kind of safety when you're at work, there's a different kind of safety when you're at play, there's a different kind of safety when you're having sex, And all these things vary within their own category, but they're all still situationally applied.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a reason on the back of the ticket that you accept the risk.
Well, and to some extent, I think we should be able to, and part of this is we can choose our risks. I think if somebody, the idea is that you should be willing to take more risks and go out of your comfort zone. But at some level, if somebody says, no, that's not my risk, back off, fucker. Okay? But, yes?
I'll just throw something out there because, our brains are working so well at this point that maybe you can't affirm. But I think part of the reason you mentioned earlier how it works. Words aren't just words. They have meaning and weight, right? So over time, we've evolved language around these principles so that we have something to point to. So we can say this is what it means to go to be a burn, right? We talk about seasonal burns having official status. So my question is kind of about
I'll be, yeah, 4 minutes left, yeah. I'll be very honest and say that I don't think Burning Man has a good handle on that. I don't think, outside of people holding themselves accountable, I don't think we have a really clear sense of what accountability means in a Burning Man context yet. I think that is a gray area we're still working on. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I kind of following up on that. I think it would be a great and useful dialogue between boards and RCs, and maybe also with some of the folks in Keyboard to think about this. You know, as a board member, I need an RC in my region to vouch for the fact or to sign off on to support the regional status of our event. And the outline of the basis for that is they basically need to sign off on the idea that we are compliant in our preparation, all that we do in getting ready for the event, and that the event is a 10 principles compliant event. And that's a pretty interesting hammer inside, if it chooses to be used as such. But it's also just in the world of kind of being accountable as a board member, you're interpreting these principles and saying, are we doing it right? And sometimes you hear you're not. And you hear you're not in a way that sounds totally crazy to you. Like literally crazy. But apparently they think I'm literally crazy. And there is a real practical challenge there that is inconsistent, and maybe I just haven't lived it long enough, but feels pretty profoundly inconsistent with what the principles are, that we use them as an interpretive intermediary in that kind of decision.
Yeah, we're running low on time, so I'm going to address this, say one more thing, and then this has already gone on way too long. So I think that what we are running into is the fact that we are entering into a new phase in Burning Man culture. Burning Man started out as an experiment. Larry going, hey, Jerry, you want to burn a man? And all of a sudden the experiment took off, and suddenly there were way too many people on Baker Beach, and the cops were shutting it down, and they had to go someplace else. So they went someplace else, and they took it to the desert, and then it became a frontier. It was a new frontier, and it was the Wild West in so many ways. And more and more people came. And as more and more people came, eventually it became a culture. And I think, honestly, the period that Tony's been talking about from sort of 96, 97, 98 is the transition period where it moved from the Wild West to a culture. Larry's actually written an essay, How the West Was Won. And suddenly you're dealing with a whole new set of challenges. An experiment has a different set of challenges than a frontier, and a frontier has a different set of challenges than a culture. And the culture kept growing, and suddenly we needed 10 principles, we needed this communications tool. And suddenly, you know, we're talking about, and then we reach this point where, okay, wow, now the event is too big and the regionals are growing. We're now reaching a point where we're becoming a high civilization. And that has a whole separate set of challenges, and what you're talking about is exactly the kind of challenge that comes up with that. And so this is the new stuff we're working on. And I agree with you, there's an issue here. I'm not neck deep in it, as some of you are, but it certainly looks that way from my vantage point. And the truth is, it should be worked out. I mean, I think this is something we're going to hash out and work through, and I think we're just going to have to do it. We're just going to have to do the work. There is no half-assing it. But it is to be done. So I think that's what we're seeing, is that we are entering a new phase where we have to figure out, okay, man, we're a global, emerging high culture now. What the fuck? And that what the fuck is different from the what the fucks that came before. That was an applause line, so I shall end there. Thank you very much. Thank you, Misha. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, everybody, for participating.